The tables for everyone, I think. But anyway, we will. If there's not, we can. I'm sure the press club staff will sort that out. So welcome. Thank you all for coming to what I trust will be a fascinating conversation on the sovereignty and security of our nation. This conversation and many others like it are urgently needed. Today we'll be confronting tough realities that regrettably both sides of politics in Australia presently prefer to ignore. For 80 years we've regarded our great ally, the United States of America, as having shared values and shared interests. Well, not all interests were aligned all the time, but certainly we felt the values were. It's very hard to say that today. Donald Trump plainly does not believe in the international rules-based order. He sought to reconcile with Vladimir Putin to the point of temporarily cutting off military aid and intelligence sharing to Ukraine. He's used the vast might of the United States not to pressure the invader to come to the negotiating table, but rather to kneecap the ability of the heroic, wronged victim of aggression to resist. At the same time, he's imposed or threatened to impose crippling tariffs on Canada with the express stated purpose of compelling Canada to become the 51st state of the United States. He said repeatedly that Canada should not exist as an independent country and the border is fictional. Canada has been a loyal ally, peaceful neighbour of the United States. It is, thanks to a free trade agreement renewed by Mr. Trump in 2017, thoroughly integrated into the North American economy. It is a member of NATO. Mr. Trump's claim to Canada and his effort to annex it sounds far too similar to Vladimir Putin's claim that Ukraine is not a real country and that its border is fictional and so on. In response, the new Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, has said that Canada's old relationship with the United States, and I quote, based on deepening integration of our economies and tight security and military cooperation, is over. And if that were not enough, Trump has threatened to annex Greenland one way or the other, despite it being a dependent territory of Denmark, another NATO ally. Now, I could go on, but I won't. We cannot allow our affection for America and Americans, our long shared history, to blind us from the objective reality that the United States has political values under this administration more aligned to the might is right worldview of Mr. Putin than they are to ours, or indeed to any of Mr. Trump's modern predecessors, whether they are Republican or Democrat. Now, obviously, participants can say whatever they like, but I haven't invited everyone to discuss a performance review of President Trump. It's only a one-day conference. We can't change him. He was chosen by Americans, and he has more political power over the Congress and his own party than any president in my lifetime. So we are like the tourist lost in the country lanes of Ireland who pulls into a pub and asks for directions to Dublin, only to be told, if I were you, I wouldn't be starting from here. But we are starting from here. Some people in this town, speaking from their heart more than their head, will tell you that this is all just froth and bubble, and normal transition will resume, if not soon, certainly in 4 years. We shouldn't be so sure. Look at the young men, including the Vice President, said to be the future of the MAGA movement. We should not assume that America First Trump style is going to evaporate anytime soon. So if Trump's America believes might is right and will use its economic and military power to advance America at the expense of others, whether they are allies or adversaries, what should we in Australia do? Trump makes it very clear, it's on the tin, that he is both a less reliable and a more demanding ally. So how do we in Australia recalibrate? Certainly we need to do more, be more resilient and independent. And yet, with an exquisitely bad timing, decisions in recent years have made us far more dependent on America, just as America was becoming less dependable. Not through weariness or neglect, the subject of many books written by many of you in this room, but now by deliberate design. To set the scene, we'll first discuss the threat we face. And this is our panel here just with me now on the stage. What is the other from which we hoped our great ally would defend us? Then we'll discuss AUKUS and examine the question both sides of politics refuse to countenance. What do we do if we end up with no submarines at all? An outcome contemplated by the parties to the agreement, reflected in the legislation, but to date ignored, if not denied, by both sides of politics. And if I may just add a touch of reality here, the transfer of a Virginia-class submarine to Australia depends, among other things, on the President certifying to Congress that the sale will not degrade the undersea capabilities of the US Navy and that the US submarine industrial base has the capacity to build sufficient submarines for the needs of the US and Australian navies. The US Navy maintains it needs that industrial base, being substantially General Dynamics Electric Boat and Huntington Ingalls Newport News shipbuilding, to produce 2 Virginias a year. And 3 years ago set the target of reaching 2 per annum by 2028, the level that is said to meet the US Navy's needs going forward, and 2.33 a year by 2030, the level needed to meet the additional needs of the RAN, so it is said. The current rate of production is 1.1 per annum, confirmed only a few weeks ago, on the 11th of March, in fact, by the Department of Navy to the Congress. In fact, it has been flat for years and has never reached 2 boats per annum. So the ramp to double production in just 3 years is as steep as it is unlikely. This despite more than $9 billion of additional funding contributed to the industrial base since 2018. These blunt realities are not acknowledged by our government, which insists, as does the opposition, that the Virginias will arrive from 2032. Now, I hope in this forum we'll have an honest and intelligent discussion about what our plan B should be, or how we live without any submarines at all. Following lunch, we can then discuss how we can defend ourselves without America. And finally, we discuss in the last session how we advance our national interest in a might is right world. The conversation today is on the record. It is not, as we advised, one where the Chatham House rule applies, which some people think means you can only repeat what you are told to one person at a time, but I think everyone here knows that's not the case. We are recording the proceedings, and while it's not being streamed live, we plan to make it available as 4 podcasts, because this conversation today is too important to be had in a room of just 100 people. The Australian public deserves a better level of debate and discussion on matters that are fundamental to the security of our country. Now, the panellists have been asked to keep their initial remarks to 8 minutes so that we have plenty of time for discussion, questions or comments in the room. And my role, after I conclude these remarks, will be to chair the panels and encourage a wide and open discussion. I'll be giving a speech here at a regular press club lunch tomorrow, so my remarks today are uncharacteristically brief. At the conclusion of the 4th panel, James Curran will sum up the day with some concluding remarks. Finally, I want to thank all of those who helped make today possible, especially my advisor, Kerry Pinkstone, and assistant Aaron Wingreen, also Lucy West and her friends Laura and Matthew from the ANU, of course the staff at the National Press Club, and finally James Curran and Chris Flynn, and all of you who, when I phoned to ask if holding this forum was a good idea, warmly encouraged it. So thank you again for joining us. Let's make sure we keep the discussion respectful and courteous so we don't detract from the importance of the substance of these issues to our nation. Thank you. So, without further ado, we have a very distinguished panel, Dr. Heather Smith, Professor Hugh White and Dr. Geoff Raby. The first speaker is, we're going to go in the order of Hugh, Geoff and then Heather. So Hugh.
Well, thanks Malcolm. It's a great pleasure to be in a room, if I can put it this way, with so many old friends. And thank you, Malcolm, for a remarkable piece of, if I can put it this way, private public policy entrepreneurship in bringing us all together. So you've posed two questions for us. The first is, what are the threats that we face? And the second is, are the assumptions that underline our policies valid? I'm going to address those questions in the reverse order. The assumptions that underline Australia's, and I'll focus primarily on strategic policy, partly because there are plenty of economists sitting here. The assumptions that underline Australia's strategic policy are essentially US leadership of, I'll use a conventional expression, the rules-based order globally. United States' continued leadership in Asia, and particularly its role in containing and/or balancing China, and America's role as Australia's ultimate security guarantee. Now, the source of those assumptions, let's call them judgments, are a set of expectations we have made about the durability of the decisions that America made at the end of the Cold War. That is, that it was willing, a bit to some of our surprise, to continue to maintain the kind of global role it had maintained during the Cold War once the Soviet Union had disappeared. And it made those judgments, as all countries make their policy judgments, on the basis of a balance between costs and benefits. The United States in the 1990s judged that the cost of preserving global leadership would be low because no major power would choose to contest America's role as the unipolar global leader, and because even if they did, America would retain as far as ahead as anyone could see an unchallengeable superiority in every dimension of national power, including particularly economic and military power. And moreover, they judged that the benefits would be high, that a US-led global order would sustain free trade and globalisation, would promote democracy, and was desirable in itself, partly because it reflected what one might call America's sense of its destiny. And you might also say it was congenial to Washington because it continued the old habits of the Cold War. They'd invested enormously in the infrastructure, particularly the alliance infrastructure of the Cold War, and they didn't see any reason to let it go. Now, it transpires that those assumptions about the balance between costs and benefits for maintaining the global order, or the US role that sustains our assumptions, those assumptions were all wrong. The costs of maintaining global leadership turn out to have been much higher than the United States expected for two reasons. The first is because the great powers that were meant to accept Americans' primacy don't. In particular, Russia doesn't and China doesn't. They don't accept a unipolar order, they seek, at best, a multipolar order. Second reason the costs have ended up being higher is that United States economic and military primacy preponderance has turned out to be much more fragile than people thought. We have, after all, lived through the biggest shift in the distribution of wealth and power in human history, and that has fundamentally changed the power calculus. It also transpires that America's military predominance is not as great as people thought, particularly because we underestimated the impact of nuclear weapons on these questions. And moreover, the benefits to the United States of maintaining its position globally turn out to be lower than people thought. Partly because America decided that globalisation isn't actually such a great idea after all. Partly because it transpired that America didn't think promoting democracy was such a great idea after all. And perhaps above all, because the idea that America had to sustain global leadership in order to make the world safe for America turned out not to be true. Now, a lot of these problems were clear long before Donald Trump appeared. It became clear, you could say, when Putin gave his speech in Munich in 2007, and then touched up Georgia in 2008, and then touched up Ukraine in 2014, that he wasn't buying US primacy as a foundation for the global order. And I think the historians will judge that around about the time of the global financial crisis, it became clear that the Chinese didn't either. And America's response to that challenge, as it became clear, has always been weak. When Russia emerged as a challenger to the European order in the years after 2007, 2008, America did nothing to reinforce the position it had established in the post-Cold War order in Europe. And when Washington finally woke up to the challenge from China, and Barack Obama came here just up the hill to announce the pivot in 2011, well, the pivot goes down in history as a perfect case study of a policy with no substance. Now, the challenges today are much starker. Of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a very direct challenge both to the European order and to the global order. And what we've discovered in that even before Donald Trump appeared, is the United States is not prepared to do what's necessary to prevent Russia reasserting its position in Eastern Europe as a great power, because it's not prepared to go to war with Russia. I think it's right not to be prepared to go to war with Russia, but that is the strategic consequence of America's reluctance. And in Asia, it transpires that the United States has not been willing to do what has been necessary to preserve the military superiority, maritime superiority in the Western Pacific necessary for it to resist China's challenge. It now finds itself in a position that if it faces a military challenge from China, it would face a war that it can't win and can't deter. Now, there are good reasons for the United States to step back, because in the end, the forces that impelled the United States to adopt that posture during the Cold War don't apply today, because during the Cold War, the United States legitimately feared that a Soviet Union that could spread its influence in Europe and Asia could end up dominating the whole of Eurasia and threatening the United States at home in the Western Hemisphere. Neither China or Russia poses that kind of threat to the United States today, partly because they each have one another to worry about. And so, as Donald Trump says, those big, beautiful oceans do keep America secure from the kind of great power challenges it faces from Russia and China. The strange thing about what that means is that the United States is now today happy with multipolarity, happy with an order in which there are a number of great powers around the world, each of them more or less equal, each of them dominant in their own regions, as long as the United States has the Western Hemisphere, which is, as we've seen, Malcolm mentioned some of the more colourful examples, is very much the focus of Trump's diplomacy, if that's the right word for it at the moment. Now, the reason why we've been misled about America's underlying objectives, and therefore misled about the validity of our own assumptions, is that people in Washington, the Bidens, the Sullivans, the Blinkens, have kept on talking as if the United States still had the old objectives. They are subject, I think, to a serious collective delusion. I'm one of those who grew up with a great deal of respect for the United States strategic system, but these were, after all, the guys who took us to war in Iraq. They do make mistakes, and this is a big one. The strange thing about Donald Trump, and one of the most confusing things about this moment in history, is that it's Donald Trump who understands the underlying dynamics of America's strategic position better than the old guys, better than the guys who supported the assumptions we're dealing with. In fact, I think the historians are going to judge, boy, watch out for this, Donald Trump's doing us a favour by making clear to us things we've been determined not to recognise for ourselves. So I think, answer to Malcolm's question, I think those three assumptions that I mentioned at the beginning, upon which our entire foreign policy is based, are false. And Donald Trump is proving them to be false, but we should have recognised they were false long before he got back into office. And what does that mean for the threats that we face? It's important to distinguish two quite different parts of this question. It is very clear to me that China's challenge to US leadership in Asia, which has been the foundation of our security, you could say, well, certainly since 1941, but you could arguably say since 1914. China's challenge to that fundamentally changes the features of the Asian international order upon which we have relied on our security. It's been American primacy which has meant that Australia has not had to fear a great power, a military threat. And China's challenge to that superiority raises again the possibility that Australia might one day face a great power threat. But that's not to say that China today threatens Australia, PLA Navy circumnavigation notwithstanding. So the challenge for us is not to suddenly start building up forces to support the United States in trying to maintain its primacy in Asia, because I don't think that's going to happen. That would require us to be prepared to fight a war which, in support of the United States, which the United States, as far as I can see, has no intention of fighting and has no chance of winning. What's important for us is to build the forces that we will need against that increased long-term possibility of ourselves facing a major power threat without the support of the United States. In other words, the key focus for Australian defence policy should be to maximise our capacity to raise the costs and risks to a major Asian power like China, or one day India, to allow us to defend ourselves independently against a major Asian power. And that suggests, amongst other things, that AUKUS isn't a great idea. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugh. I should have said at the outset, Hugh White, as I'm sure everyone knows, and there's a longer bio, there is Emeritus Professor of Strategic Studies at ANU. Among his many achievements, he was the founding director of ASPI. He's worked for several Labor leaders, and he's also had senior positions in the Defence Department. Next speaker is Dr. Geoff Raby, was Australia's ambassador to China from 2007 to 11, served as the ambassador to the World Trade Organisation in Geneva and ambassador to APEC, among many other distinguished achievements. Geoff.
Thanks, Malcolm. And look, congratulations also on bringing this together. It's a very important initiative, and thanks everyone for coming. Because of time constraints, bear with me, I'll read my comments, and hopefully it won't exceed your mandatory limits. Well, quite clearly, Australia faces many security threats, as it's the case for all countries. But the reality is here today, the only one we're actually interested in is at this conference, and which will hang over all of our discussions, is of course China. That's the 500-kilo panda in the room today, and that's what really this is all about. So it's widely accepted. It's widely accepted that China is the threat to our national security, so much so that it's seldom mentioned by name. Perhaps that helps to make it seem more menacing. It's some sort of dark, pervasive presence. For example, 2 weeks ago, the Australian Financial Review, no longer ably led by Michael Stutchbury, so that's probably why this happened, had an editorial which talked about the threat to Australia's security. It mentioned the threat 3 times, but the threat was never named, never identified, because you don't have to these days in Australia. Quite clearly, the editorial was entirely about China, the China threat. Now, sometimes, and I'll admit, some of the newspapers worry that Australians might be missing what is the actual threat. And occasionally, as we've seen with the Sydney Morning Herald, red arrows will be plastered on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald just to make sure, thrusting down from China towards Australia, just to make sure that we really do know what the threat is out there. And of course, this is all of a piece with the yellow peril threat to Australia from the north, which in turn was deeply entwined for a century with the racist white policy of Australia, white Australia policy. Among the well-represented grey hairs here today, I'm sure that many of you will remember that for a long period, Indonesia was supposed to present an imminent military threat to Australia. We purchased hideously expensive F-111 jets against this threat, which were never used in anger, and now lay buried in the outback of Queensland. And in the 19th century, we built cannon batteries around the coast of Australia against the imminent Russian invasion, which of course never came, and those cannons had never been used in anger. And shamefully, we wasted Australian lives in Vietnam, joined to the hip of the US, to prevent a downward thrust of communism towards Australia, as the Southeast Asian dominoes were supposed to fall one after the other until Australia fell. Our own ideology had blinded us to such an extent that we were incapable of distinguishing a national liberation struggle from communist imperialism. Our own abysmal foreign and security policy failures should give us cause to pause, reflect, and to try to do a better job analysing and understanding our threat environment. So to the China threat. It's asserted, as I said, but seldom analysed. It's regarded as self-evident, a revealed truth. China's expanding military strength is given as prima facie evidence of such a threat. But China's intent, capacity to execute, and constraints are rarely, if ever, discussed. Whether we like it or not, and Hugh has just said, and mainly we don't like it, China will become the regional hegemon based on its size, geostrategic location, and continuing strong economic performance. As I argued in my recent book, Great Game On, China has now become the preeminent power in Eurasia. For the first time in China's history, its internal Eurasian land borders are more or less secure. And being a great power, it will project power globally. It is now, because it's secured its internal borders in Eurasia, it's free to project power. And so no one should have been surprised when the PLA Navy sailed down through the Tasman Sea. It brought back to my mind a reminiscence of Teddy Roosevelt's Great White Fleet that he sent around the world in the early 20th century to demonstrate US global power. That's what great powers do, and China will be doing that more and more often. So while we don't know what China will do as a regional hegemon, it's unlikely that it will want to emulate the European 19th century and US and Japanese 20th century colonialism. My best bet on China is influence, yes, imperialism, no. So what then is China's grand strategy? Well, we don't really know, but as far as we can divine it, I would argue that it's to make the world safe for the Chinese Communist Party. In other words, it's essentially inward-looking, focused on stability and domestic and external security. But whatever China's intent may be, and we may ascribe the evilest motivations to it, it is also necessary to ask the question, what is China's capacity to execute? Failure to ask the question is a fundamental flaw in so much of our strategic analysis. Most things are possible, and strategic analysts are very quick to talk about what's possible, but the key analytical judgment to make is to assign probabilities to possible outcomes. On this basis, I suggest that the probability of China becoming an existential threat to Australia or any other place, except for Taiwan, is very low. As I argued in my other book, China's Grand Strategy, China is and will remain a constrained superpower, or as I call it, Prometheus bound. It's constrained by its geography, 14 countries on its border, 22,000 kilometres of land border to defend, and although these borders are now more secure as China's become the preeminent power in Eurasia, they still need defending. It's constrained by its region. It's hemmed in by powerful states, Japan, India, South Korea, and Vietnam. It's still an empire with unresolved territorial issues inside its borders, Xinjiang, Tibet, Taiwan, and now Hong Kong. And these absorb vast quantities of resources for internal security. But most importantly of all, China is utterly dependent on world markets for most of what it needs to keep its own economic engines turning. And this is critical for domestic social stability and keeping the Communist Party in power. It's therefore hugely vulnerable to global sanctions. It's not a giant gas station run by gangsters like Russia. So if the China threat's been much oversold and its discussion in Australia lacks serious analytical depth, what is the main strategic issue we are facing? Australia has followed the US into treating China as a strategic competitor, despite our interests aligning in so many areas with China, not least, of course, trade. China also does not present an existential threat to the US, as Hugh has just told us, and no one country could threaten the US in the Western Hemisphere. But rather, China challenges US primacy, and we have decided that to pay for protection from the United States, we will support the US in seeking to maintain primacy over China. And through this, we hope that we will keep the US engaged in the region as well, despite our being disappointed frequently. In doing so, we have defined our interests as being more or less identical to those of the United States. An example of this really was astounding last week when the Chief of Air Force being interviewed on the ABC said, and I'll quote, "We are well aligned, Australia and the US. We are well aligned, and we are very comfortable with a strong relationship, and that our nation's interest and the US interest very much are the same, and the challenges that we face are the same here in the Indo-Pacific." That's the Chief of Air Force on the ABC, interviewed by Andrew Green. Really? Is that what the broad Australian community thinks? And if that were true once, Does one still believe that to be so with Trump and MAGA group running the show? Certainly, we could be pretty sure that it would not be the view of Australians over climate change, withdrawal from Paris Convention, gender identity and diversity, foreign aid, national sovereignty as it affects Canada, Greenland, Denmark or Gaza, and more. But in all of this, Trump may be helping Australia get its strategic bearings more closely aligned with its crucial and actual interests. Trump does not seem to know or care about US exceptionalism. And if he doesn't, then maintaining US primacy is irrelevant. And as Vice President Vance comments about the US's involvement in his words, useless wars over the past 40 years, is saying just that. In that case, the US could coexist alongside a hegemonic China. As President Bill Clinton said in the early 90s, the world is big enough to accommodate more than one superpower. This may make Australia's strategic policy choices rather more straightforward. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Geoff. Now, our third speaker is Dr. Heather Smith, who we all know has been Secretary and Deputy Secretary across a range of portfolios, including Deputy Director General of the Office of National Intelligence, and most recently Heather led or co-led the 2024 Independent Review of Australia's National Intelligence Community. Heather.
Thank you, Malcolm. And can I also add my thanks on your leadership in pulling this forum together. So good morning, everybody. It's good to be here and be on this panel. I'm going to focus my remarks probably more what are the implications for Australia. Starting with the point when I gave a speech at the Australian Institute of International Affairs last year where I thought our challenge at that time, well before the election, was how do we really navigate in this fragmenting global order, whereas now I think our challenge is how do we survive in an illiberal order. So the threats, as Hugh said, have been building a long time for Australia, but it's the fragmentation now of the international economic system that is now a fact, and the post-Cold War order isn't collapsing, it has now collapsed. The US is dismantling all the foundations of its global hegemony along with the norms and values that have underpinned our bilateral relationship. And I think as Hugh alluded to, this dismantling is not necessarily going to be reversed by a change of administration going forward. Once we lose those principles, it's a long way back to get them back. The US, as we've seen, has unashamedly adopted a mercantilistic view of the world with concurrent conflicting goals, as we see where tariffs seem to be the answer for every problem. And the US believes that it has been systematically exploited by the global system it created, ignoring the benefits it has accrued over decades. I think perhaps more ominous for Australia is Trump's view that the US economy needs a fundamental and, if necessary, painful transformation. I think that Trump is prepared to risk a US recession and financial instability and ongoing volatility to achieve this, with all the attendant fallout this brings to the global economy, represents quite a marked shift from the last time Trump was in office. It raises the possibilities that the 2020s could be a lost global decade, both lost opportunity, lost growth in living standards, further erosion of social cohesion, and all creating that very fertile territory for even more assault on what remains of the liberal democratic order. I think we all know that the parallels to the 1930s are obvious in that context. To say that Australia is not well positioned, I think, is an understatement. It is a dog-eat-dog world. Intergenerational consequences for our security, prosperity, and our social cohesion are profound. But I think our political and some of our bureaucratic class are largely admiring the problem. So for me, the biggest challenge for Australia to overcome is the inability of our political class to really position Australia in this new world order. In terms of the policy assumptions that have underpinned our economic and foreign and defence policy, I think our policy playbook has been disrupted, but it's not been completely torn up. The assumptions underlying our security and prosperity are being reshaped. Obviously, alliance, our dependence on the multilateral system, and our integration with the Indo-Pacific, and this has been going on for a long time. What hasn't changed, though, is the centrality of economic success at home and how central that is to our ability to both project soft and hard power. Beyond our borders, we don't really know what comes next and how that will inform policy, but like my colleagues, it would seem to rest on how a number of questions play out. Firstly, will the Republic hold? Will the equilibrating forces in the US political system emerge? Will Trump's agenda actually stumble on its own contradictions? And has America finally lost its capacity for renewal? Secondly, what will the new international order look like in a world characterised by populism, isolationism, and protectionism? Thirdly, how does Australia balance our interests and values as the US retreats and China positions itself to realise its ambitions to be the regional hegemon earlier than it expected? And finally, does Trump have a master plan for the Indo-Pacific? It certainly doesn't appear so. Is China the ultimate target, and to what end? Is there a grand bargain to be had over Taiwan? Trump is clearly not interested in retaining US primacy, as Hugh mentioned. Most of that era has now passed, as most would agree. And we don't really know what the narrow agenda of US engagement and leadership in the Indo-Pacific could look like, but certainly from Australia's interests, ensuring a military balance of power in the Indo-Pacific would seem to be important. So I think we do need a bit of humility if we think that we know all the answers to those questions. I like Hugh's point, and I was going to quote Hal Brands, who had a great piece in Foreign Affairs about, you know, a sharp-elbowed superpower might not be the worst thing right now in history. Trump has a chance to be an ambivalent saviour of the American order if he can resist the temptation to be its gravedigger. So for Australia, that's a massive if. What is clear is that intervention in markets to build nation-state competitiveness and resilience is now the global norm in the name of economic security. Ironically, though, Washington's economic policy is now looking a lot like Beijing's. As Mike Froman has said, Washington is already living in Beijing's world, having adopted its economic playbook. The world's largest, most dynamic economy and our largest investment partner by far is now characterised by elements of crony capitalism and is dismantling the scaffolding that has underpinned its dynamism through science, technology, education, and through its soft power. But beyond the current chaos, it's also unclear what structural changes in the US economy this is going to give rise to, the extent to which it erodes the global business and investment climate, and whether it signals the beginning of the end of US financial exceptionalism and the privilege that comes with being the issuer of a global reserve currency. So for Australia, we are in uncharted waters. It's lonelier and it's a more fraught world for us in this multipolar world, as demonstrated by both the US and China having engaged in economic coercion against us. Policies of self-reliance will only get us so far, while retaliation would be an act of self-harm, as we know with tariffs. In the end, Australia cannot escape the fact that our prosperity has been built on well-functioning global markets. A whack-a-mole, siloed approach won't work either when our policy settings on defence, security, trade, technology, education, investment, and regulation are all being challenged at the same time. We can weather the direct effect of US tariffs, the indirect effects from the supply chain chaos and slowing of regional growth, especially in China, obviously will be much harder for Australia to offset. And we could face a diabolical choice if the US looks to punish third parties for economic cooperation in aiding China's manufacturing and technology juggernaut. We also, I think, need to be more concerned about the implications for global capital flows and foreign investment flows than what we do of the direct impacts of tariffs. So now that we're sort of moving past the shock and awe of the Trump administration, I think from Australia's perspective, we really do need to get on the offensive by reimagining and planning for greater strategic resilience and competitiveness, and by accelerating and pursuing new trade agreements, rethinking regional groupings, and engaging more and with those with whom our interests align. So more hedging of our interests and more diversified relationships. But above all, we need to get our domestic house in order, and quickly. If we don't, we significantly limit our strategic flexibility. The multidimensional challenges we face require a response that is similarly multifaceted and well coordinated. We will need to conceive of national power that involves just not our military power projection, but a stronger economy than we currently have. I think like-minded countries will also need to think how to salvage, but more fundamentally redesign a different multilateral system that is more inclusive and more broadly linked to societal well-being. We need to be ready for the US to withdraw or have significant disruption within the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD and the G20. And remember, the US is down to host the G20 next year. And as for China, we also need to be wary, as it at least rhetorically takes advantage of the chaos to promote itself as a reliable economic partner and the upholder of the multilateral system to all. So this is not an era for incrementalism when it comes to policy. The policies needed to address our declining living standards and raise our productivity growth are very well documented. Yet as we head to an election, there is no national consensus or bipartisan approach on how to manage these tectonic shifts, nor a public understanding of the trade-offs that will have to be made to build this resilience at home and embark on a sustained focus on deterrence as we inevitably ratchet up defence spending. So at some point, all this does need to be squared up with the Australian people, especially as it seems likely that the public's trust in the US alliance will perhaps wane. So I think Australia needs a stronger, coherent reform and growth agenda, one, as I mentioned, that allows us the strategic flexibility to survive in this very uncertain world. And while doing this, we must remain pragmatic. And this is probably where I slightly differ with my two colleagues. As challenging as it may be at times, it remains in our national interest to work with the US and to find alignments where we can, and to protect our military and our intelligence cooperation. There is simply no alternative at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you. Well, thank you for three great presentations. And Heather, I think what the last point you made about preserving our alliance and maintaining our military and intelligence cooperation, I don't think Hugh or Geoff would suggest we should stop that. I mean, I think the issue, despite what you might read in well-known newspaper, the agenda here is not to destroy AUKUS or abandon the American alliance. It's really to make sure that both work for us in changed circumstances. And you, I think you really do very well, and thank you for expressing the point that these have got to be defended but made to work for us in these changed environment. So the floor is open. Who would like to? Now, please, if you could just to favour my failing eyesight, if you could just you get the microphone, just introduce yourself briefly. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Hayley Channer from the US Studies Centre. A question actually on Heather's last point about still being aligned with the United States in some areas. What would it look like in future for Australia to pursue two parallel but contradictory foreign policies? One where we're promoting a free, open trading order, the WTO, etc., with Japan and other countries, and at the same time continuing to try and keep the United States within our partnership and sort of allowing its protectionism and tariffs and that type of activity. Can we pursue those two foreign policies successfully at once?
It's a very good question. Can we walk and chew gum at the same time? I think we can. I think our depths of relationships, our economic relationships in the region put us in good stead, because over time we've never, we've always been very pragmatic. We've never taken a particular side. We've really worked for open regionalism and an open multilateral system. So I do think we can still work with the US in multilateral forums. I think we do need to remember that we do have a deep set of relationships with the US across many institutional fora that won't all be taken out by what's going on in the civil service. So, you know, that two-pronged approach, though, does require a lot of flexibility, and it does require diplomacy and deep diplomacy. And I would hope going forward, as part of that need for strategic flexibility, is that our diplomatic effort becomes even more important rather than less important, and as we pursue that dual approach.
And Heather, would you, thank you for the question, but the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was an American initiative essentially, which the Trump 1 abandoned, was maintained and continued without the Americans, and of course has grown since then. So that's a good example of being able to walk and chew gum at the same time on a trade point of view in the first Trump administration.
It is, but maybe I'll come back to the G20, which is something close to my heart, I guess, is I think we will have to form coalitions now within the multilateral groupings in order to pursue our interests. And, you know, to be clear, Hugh referred to Obama. The US was always becoming very transactional when it comes to economic policy as far back as a decade ago. So coalitions were already forming which had wider views about the importance of an open multilateral system. And the WTO appellate body alternative mechanism has also taken place in response to the US not blocking that over a period of time. So I think that's a really important point.
Malcolm, can I just, there's a really good question, Hayley, gets to the heart of a lot of our issues, and also just goes to the point that Heather made at the end of her remarks. I think it's very important to recognise that the real issue we face is not whether we withdraw from the alliance with the United States. We should continue to try and exploit the relationship with the United States for everything we can. The real question is whether we should rely on the United States not withdrawing from us. And if it's true the United States no longer seeks to maintain its position as the primary power in East Asia and the Western Pacific, then the fundamental strategic rationale for the United States having Australia as an ally disappears. It's not our ally because it likes us. All alliances are transactional.
Yep.
I mean, they're not transactional when they're at the press club, when the cameras are rolling. But in the Situation Room at 3 o'clock in the morning, every alliance is transactional. And the strategic rationale for the United States having an alliance with Australia is that it's an important support for their position in the Western Pacific. If it doesn't seek to preserve that, then it walks away. And the implication for us then is not that we want to walk away from the alliance for the United States, but we don't want to frame our policy around the expectation that the United States will be there for us. And that's what drives the requirement for us to make the big decision, whether the primary focus of our strategic policy is to try and work with the United States to support the United States' position in East Asia, or whether to build our own capability to look after ourselves in an East Asia from which the United States is no longer playing a significant role.
Thanks. Geoff.
Yeah, thanks. And I just want to make a footnote to Heather's comment. Of course, Australia has always been very good and very active in coalition building and forming different groups. We created and ran for 20-odd years the Cairns Group. The United States was not part of it. And in many ways, the United States was on the opposite side of the argument in the Cairns Group. When Hawke created APEC, at first, the US was not part of APEC. And Gareth tells a great story about George Shultz putting the sign of Zorro on his chest. Jim Baker, yeah. And you know, Gareth led the Cambodian peace settlement. We have always been very active. I fear that in the last decade, as we have become much more a champion of US primacy, we have become much, much less active and much less effective in that middle power group diplomacy, which we were so good at once.
Thank you. Now, Alan Dupont, you had
Really good point.
Is this working? Yes, you can hear me. Geoff, I'd just like you to shed a bit more light on the 500-kilo panda that you characterised before. So I know you've been very critical of what you consider to be Australian threat inflation of China, the China threat. And I noticed in your comments this morning you talked a lot about the constraints on China. But what I'd like you to do is to address some of the behaviour of China to help us understand why you think China is not necessarily a problem for Australia. If I can just give you two quick examples. So it's not just a lot of Australians who think China is a potential problem, because it fundamentally has a different value system to us. It has fundamentally different interests, but particularly its behaviour in the region. And it's not only Australia, a lot of Southeast Asian countries and North Asian countries feel the same way. Two quick examples. China's behaviour in the South China Sea, but you know the story, going back to 2014. And the Chinese embassy's list of 14 grievances, demands to the Australian government, I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago. Now, when you look at China's behaviour, do you think there are not legitimate reasons for concerns about what a China world might look like for Australia?
Yeah, a good point, and I'm glad you raised it. Look, generally, I start this from the position that great powers behave badly, because that's what great powers do. That's the reality of the world we live in. I think there's two specific examples. The South China Sea goes back long before 2014. It's been an issue long before 2014, and it is what it is. China has territorial claims in the area, and it's not going to step back from it, and it's a great power, and it doesn't have to step back from it, even if we don't like it, even if you think it's unfair. But not all Southeast Asians feel threatened or disturbed by China. In fact, what they don't want is to be put into a position where they have to choose between the United States and China. And in many ways, we have chosen, and that puts us at odds with our neighbours. And I think that's a very important foreign policy issue we have to work our way through. I'm delighted you raised the 14 points raised by the Chinese embassy, because you must not have read my AFR column on that a couple of years ago. There's a great confusion between aide-memoire, which is a diplomatic term, and a démarche. And these were an aide-memoire to remind me what's wrong. And it was jotted down. Our French ambassador friend can explain later, Alan. It wasn't a démarche. Very big difference. But the point is, and that takes us to what has been a very bad, self-destructive period in Chinese foreign policy behaviour, and that's the so-called wolf warrior. And it was bad. It destroyed Chinese soft power. It'll take decades, if ever, for that to come back. And you see it in the Lowy polls, for example, of attitudes towards China and the low level of trust. But the Chinese are pretty good at figuring out, if something's gone wrong, how to change. And wolf warrior diplomacy is gone. You're not going to get a 14-point démarche or a 14-point aide-memoire, I don't think. They recognise the damage they've done to themselves, and now they're busily in a repair mode. But that's the reality. I mean, and we will always have to live with a China for as long as the Communist Party's running the show, which is an authoritarian one-party state, and change the leader, you may get a very different, more dangerous China. But that's the world we find ourselves in, and what Hugh was saying, I fully agree with, the solution to us is not just to wait for the Americans to come and save us from this bad country.
Well, thank you. Now, please, yes.
Thanks, Amy King from the ANU, and thanks for a terrific first panel. While we're on the subject of China, I thought I'd offer some remarks sort of picking up on Heather's point about living in an international order defined by greater isolationism, fragmentation, and protectionism, and your very apt point that US policy now looks a lot more like China's in some regards. I think what's really important for us to think about when we're thinking about China's policy at the moment, and particularly its strategies of self-reliance, is that international economic engagement, economic interdependence, has always been a fundamental pillar of self-reliance for China, going back to the 30s, but 1930s that is, and very much true under Xi Jinping. For China, economic diversification of partners is seen as a crucial way for them to achieve self-reliance and national security. And so we've seen since COVID, and really since Xi came to power, a very strong effort to reduce China's over-dependence on the US and the European Union in particular, and a greater diversification of economic markets, particularly in Asia and Central Asia and beyond. Australia is one of the markets that China has become more dependent upon in the last 5 years, particularly for energy resources, but other things as well. This presents a great opportunity for Australia to actually further our own economic interests in the region, both with China, but as part of the complex supply chains that I no doubt we'll be talking more about this afternoon. But I think the challenge, and this sort of goes back to some of Geoff's comments in the panel, is that we've not had a positive statement or vision for what we want our relationship with China and indeed the wider regional order to look like over the last decade. And because we've had that vacuum, which I think, you know, you're right to say has been very much defined by US primacy and an alignment of Australian interests in that regard, it's meant that issues of foreign interference, economic sanctions on Australia, PLA transiting of Tasmania and what have you, comes to define everything about our relationship. It fills that vacuum because we've not had that positive vision from our leaders, from our bureaucracy, about what we want in this region, how we see that region as evolving and working in partnership with China to do that. I think there actually are great opportunities for Australia to do that, but we have to overcome some of the baggage of the last decade, and economic interdependence is going to be part of that story as well. Thanks.
Well, thank you. We'll probably take that as a very valuable comment, Amy. Thank you.
So, can I just make a quick comment? So, very good point. What thought that leads me to is that we have run an independent foreign policy with China, independent from the United States, on and off for a long time. I remember when I did the cabinet submission, led the drafting cabinet submission on relations with China after Tiananmen Square, and Bob Hawke was very emotional about all of that, and there was a view, you know, we have to punish China. Was it Schultz or Baker? Baker was the foreign secretary, that was the Secretary of State at the time. And Gareth would come into my office and say, you know, fuck Hawkey, we've got real interest in this country, we have to take a long-term view. And the Americans were actually disappointed that we didn't go anywhere near as far as they wanted us to go. There was a time when you know, Rick Smith up the back there was ambassador, and after Tiananmen Square, we used to go along to the annual human rights dialogue every year in Geneva. And of course, China can whistle up all the numbers, so it was never carried. It was always defeated, a pointless, useless exercise. And then Rick figured out, well, why don't we do something different and talk to the Chinese about establishing an annual human rights dialogue. And we were the first to do that. And we stopped going to the US-led vote in Geneva at the Human Rights Commission. I can cite example after example where we have acted independently, but I couldn't do that in the last decade. And that last decade is significant because that goes back to basically when the US decided that China was a strategic competitor. And we signed up on that a decade ago when you were Prime Minister, Malcolm. Sorry about that. And that has influenced our policy and behaviour since.
Well, I'm going to play a limited role here. Now, sir, you wanted to speak? Sorry. You were signalling. Sorry.
Matthew Newhouse, now at ANU. Heather, thanks for raising the multilateral system, because I think that's very important. And we have, of course, in the past played a key role in shaping that system, both under Everett, if and I might say so, under Gareth Evans in particular in the 90s. My question goes to Europe has not yet been raised alongside Asia as potential partners. And I think Europe, probably a lot of European countries have a great stake in that now as well. What do you see as the possibilities of doing more with Europe to either retain or reshape a multilateral system, as you say, perhaps in a more equal way? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think, as you know, Europe's always had a more deeper affinity with making sure the multilateral system sort of works, whereas we've had to work really hard at it, as Geoff was saying. So I think the possibilities are really prospective. I would have thought EU, Australia FTA will be given some momentum. You think when the UK pulled out of the EU, just how closer the relationship came, certainly probably more in principle than in practice. But I think Europe has been shocked in ways that really has seen, obviously, France move, the UK move to really look at what are their national interests and who do you reach out to, including over the coalition of the willing, as you old phrase, with the Ukraine. So I think, you know, we'll probably spend a lot more diplomatic effort in Europe as well going forward. So I think, you know, there are lots of opportunities there with Europe.
Good, thank you. Now, Paul Kelly.
Thanks, Malcolm. Look, we know that foreign policy is always based on contradictions, but it seems to me there's a contradiction of sorts in what Hugh has said this morning. He's told us, on the one hand, that we need to continue to develop and exploit the relationship with the United States, that alliance partnership. But he's also told us that because of the superior realism of Donald Trump, the fact is that we can't rely on the United States anymore as an alliance partner. So how do we proceed from this point? I noticed that Heather talked about the need for us to be pragmatic in terms of our dealings with the United States, but this is a fairly profound contradiction which our politicians and strategists are going to have to come to grips with. That is, we've got a deep-seated, integrated relationship with the United States that we want to continue to develop, yet on the other hand, we feel the way America is going, we can't rely upon them anymore as an alliance partner. So how do we tease out this contradiction? How do we proceed in order to try and make these contradictions workable for Australia?
No, really superb question, of course, Paul. I think the first point to make is that we address that contradiction by getting clear what our objectives are. Right at the heart of Australian strategic policy today is a deep ambivalence, I'm going to say confusion, between whether the primary focus of our strategic policy is to support the United States' primacy in Asia, and if necessary, go to war with China in order to do that, or whether our primary objective is to put ourselves in the best position to look after ourselves independently if the United States gets out of Asia. Now, I would say the first way to resolve the dilemma you've addressed is to make absolutely crystal clear that our objective is the second, that we use our alliance with the United States not as a foundation to support the United States' continuing primacy in East Asia, because that's not going to work. We use our alliance with the United States to maximise our capacity to defend ourselves independently. This is not actually an alien concept. That's the way we talked about the alliance in the 1980s and 1990s, the old self-reliance doctrine. The difference, of course, between self-reliance as we think of it today and self-reliance as we thought of it in the 80s and 90s was that in the 80s and 90s we didn't believe we had to worry about a great power challenge to our security because United States primacy was locked into the Cold War and, for that matter, the early post-Cold War structure where we were sure the United States would remain engaged to make sure we didn't face a great power threat. That's why we focused on Indonesia. It was the only threat left. But now we're back into a world, really back into the world of the 1930s. That's why that slogan about facing the worst strategic circumstances since World War II is right. For the first time, we face the prospect that we may face a great power threat. Now, I agree with Geoff that the China threat is talked up in a very sort of unfocused way. But the fact is that the reason why we in Australia have been so sure for so long that we would never face a great power threat alone is that we've had such dependence, and justified dependence, on US primacy in East Asia. If that goes, then we move from a world in which the idea of a major power challenge to Australia was in effect unthinkable to one in which it's thinkable, remote, I think quite remote, for the reasons Geoff mentioned, but not nearly as remote as it used to be. So I would say that what we need to do now is to abandon the idea that the whole purpose of our alliance with the United States is to support US primacy in East Asia, and to move instead to an approach where the purpose of our alliance with the United States is to maximise our capacity to defend ourselves independently. And that points us in very different directions, including the kinds of capabilities we develop. We need a different defence force if the primary purpose of our defence force is to support the United States against China, rather than to defend ourselves independently.
I wonder what Heather thinks of that.
So I was thinking when you're asking that question, Paul, about, the policy of strategic equilibrium, which has, I guess, been the focus of how we've played ourselves in the region, and the language that we've used in relation to China, where we'll continue to engage and cooperate where we can, disagree where we do, and just ensure that we think wisely about our national interest. So I think Peter Varghese sort of hit the nail on the head for me when he said it's not in our national interest that the US retains its primacy. It is in our national interest that we ensure that the US continues to engage and show leadership in a military sense in terms of retaining the balance of power, and then what is Australia's role in that context of that subset of how we think US leadership engagement should evolve in the region. So part of that is both how we prepare ourselves in deterrent capability, but in terms of also our self-reliance going forward. So I do think we have to adjust that language around, does it really hold? What is the strategic equilibrium that Australia seeks? And you can bifurcate the economic relationship, I think, by virtue of the question, Hayley's question, where we do have different interests from the US, and we have been able to, as Geoff said, pursue those interests through coalition building, separately from, where we do want a strong relationship, military intelligence, but also this notion of more self-reliance.
Malcolm, can I
Yes,
just...
please, sure.
Sorry, I don't want to... A really important point, I think, is that, of course, it would be most in Australia's interest if the United States is not going to be the primary power in East Asia, for it to stay in Asia, not to dominate, but to balance.
Yeah.
I wrote a book a few years ago called The China Choice, which argued precisely that that's what we should be trying to encourage the United States to do. But the moment for that is past. Nobody in Washington is interested in a balancing role in East Asia. They'll dominate or they'll get out. And the Chinese will no longer settle for that. It might have been the case in 2012 that the Chinese would end up settling for some continuing role in a US role in East Asia. But I don't think they'll settle for that now. So that would be the best outcome. We should aim for that.
Please.
Yeah.
But I think the chance of achieving that is very low.
Keep conversing.
I suppose we also have to try and understand a bit more by what is the US now, Trump versus the hawks that actually surround him. So, you've got a national security advisor and a secretary of state who really do want to think in terms of how to deal with China going forward. And Trump is so mercurial that you don't know whether one day he wants to do a deal or whether he will side with the more hardliners on China, which is a bit of a continuum of some of the Biden administration.
There is some truth in that. Although I think what's striking about the trajectory of the Trump administration so far is how far the hawks have moved in Trump's direction. Marco Rubio, in his interview with Megyn Kelly, said, "We live in a multipolar world."
Yes.
Now, that's a very radical thing for someone in Washington to say. But the other point is that no matter what they want, the fact is that spending 3.5% of GDP, the United States is not going to be able to exercise the strategic weight in Asia that's sufficient for it to play even a balancing role. Because in order to play a balancing role of some sort, it has to be able to convince the Chinese that there are some things in East Asia that it's prepared to go to war with the Chinese to assert. And the United States has simply no longer got the military posture in Asia that supports that, leaving aside the question as to whether or not it's important enough for the United States to be willing to fight a nuclear war, or to be more precise, to convince the Chinese that they're willing to fight a nuclear war. The fundamental features of any international order are determined by what great powers can convince one another they're willing to go to war over. And I don't think the United States is in a position to convince the Chinese that they're willing to go to war over anything in East Asia.
My experience with Mr. Trump is that one thing I would say quite confidently about him, he is absolutely not a warmonger.
No.
He despises the neocons, thinks the Iraq War was the greatest mistake in American foreign policy ever, and has made it pretty clear in an interview with Bloomberg, very clear, basically said that he thought Taiwan was essentially indefensible.
Yeah, and he's right about that.
But as Heather says, he is very mercurial, and he has people around him with differing views. Now, please, Kim Bergman first, and then we'll go to Sam, and then I'd love to hear from, is James, before James Lawrenson here? Where's James? There.
Yeah.
I'd love you to talk about hedges and balances and bandwagoners and where we are, but we'll come to you. We'll do Kim and then Sam, so far away, Kim.
Sure. A question mainly for you, Hugh, but I'd be very interested in your views on this as well. if the United States pulls the plug on us in terms of military hardware, we can prepare for that. There are alternatives. But what happened with Ukraine was more serious when they pulled all of their intelligence sharing. How can we prepare for the possibility of that happening?
Look, it's a hugely important question, Kim, and it does relate to intelligence, but I think it also relates to military capability more broadly. For example, the F-35 is a really critical question here, as you know better than me. Look, there is a real deep dilemma for us here. In order to achieve an independent capability, military capability for ourselves, we're going to need a lot of technology, and we're not going to be able to build it all ourselves. So we need to get technology in terms that we can maintain and that we can operate it independently. This is the question of sovereignty. It's an enormous challenge to do that. I don't think Australia is as hard to defend independently as other people do, because I think, the traditional thing that we can't defend ourselves because we're too big, I think that underestimates both the advantages we have of our maritime position and the sort of long-term operational technical balance between offence and defence in maritime warfare. I think things work in our favour, and Sam's written a lot about this, of course. But so I think it's possible to do, but we are, the way in which we've built our forces hitherto on the assumption of continuing US operational support cannot survive. We're going to have to be much more self-conscious about how we diversify our dependency. Now, there's no easy answer to how you do that, but I'm disinclined to start off from the working hypothesis that we can't do it.
And this is the subject of the third panel, really.
Yeah, it is.
So we'll have a very distinguished military panel talking about that. Yeah. Well, I reckon I'll give you a view. I think if we had no intel sharing with the United States, it would be very, very hard. Very, very, very difficult. The Five Eyes relationship benefits all the Five Eyes, but the United States is by far. I mean, Rachel Noble is here. I mean, John Fruin, former deputy head of ASD, and Rachel Noble, former Director General of ASD, is here. They would have a better view than me, but that would be a body blow for sure, no question.
And Malcolm, if I can just say, when we were doing the intel review, we spoke to all the Five Eyes, as you would expect, and notwithstanding what has transpired recently, those relationships are very deep. And obviously, and Rachel's here, it'd be great to hear from Rachel, but clearly we also contribute a lot to that relationship as well. So,
well, perhaps Rachel, would you be able to comment on this? Yeah. This is Rachel Noble, former Director General of Australian Signals Directorate.
Thank you, PM. Sorry, I'm so short, I couldn't reach the microphone. That is certainly true, and the United States is probably the most powerful and capable partner that we have, but the magic of the Five Eyes runs incredibly deep. A lot of people perhaps don't understand that it does go back to World War II. It's 80 years old. It's much more, and someone used this term before, it's much more than a transaction of just passing intelligence reports to each other, but actually a deep, deep capability partnership where any two of the five will move forward on capability development at the fastest pace and then bring the other three on at a time that they can manage. It is absolutely true that we are a net beneficiary of the intelligence collection machine of the United States. It's the biggest, the baddest and the best in the world, probably. But I think it is also fair to say that Australia punches way above its weight as a contributor into the Five Eyes and has become increasingly potent, not just on collection, but on its capability contribution. Certainly its special geography that we have, but it is a formidable, Australia is a formidable cyber offensive operator, and I think I'll have a chance to talk a little bit more about that later. So we shouldn't underestimate the power that we have in this conversation.
Perhaps, James, what you said in your book or paper, Ambiguous Alignment, that there are the great powers, US and China, and then the balancers and bandwagoners, middle and smaller powers who have to pick a side, and hedgers who avoid alliances to maximise benefits. This is, with due respect to Sam, this is not a hedgehog, which is a bit like a porcupine or even an echidna. But where is Australia sitting now?
Yes, I think Australia's been. I understand today's event is designed to sort of put a bit of a shock into the system, which is great. But I do worry that the way we're presenting Australia's foreign policy positions and our strategic assessments and responses is not entirely accurate. For example, Hugh and Geoff, you both strongly presented the view that we've gone all in championing US primacy, right? Now, I'm not sure that's actually the case. For example, when I listen to Penny Wong, she says that US primacy is already over. She says we exist in a multipolar world. You haven't seen any Australian government say anything remotely resembling that Australia supports the economic containment of China, right? We know that comes out of Washington, but no Australian government has ever said that. And so if we're not on board with containing China's economic growth, China's going to keep growing and US primacy will be over. So we're absolutely not supporting US primacy in our strategic position. So it seems to me that Australia is a bit more ambiguous and a bit more of a hedger, even though sometimes we get portrayed as sort of the prototypical balancers. I'd be keen to get your view on that.
Yeah, look, really good point, James. The secret of Australian policy is that we're bullshitting. And maybe we don't even know that we're bullshitting. And, bullshit has its place in foreign policy, but you want to know whether you're doing it or not. So you're right, and even just looking at the straight military side, if we were really serious about supporting the United States in the United States' attempts to deter China from militarily challenging the US-led order in Asia, which is what we keep on saying we're doing. I mean, Penny Wong says that stuff, but she also keeps on talking about deterring, then we would not be spending 2% of GDP on defence, and we wouldn't be spending it the way we're doing now. We have done nothing substantive to enhance our capacity to deter China over the last 10 years. And of course, on the economic front, as you say, our interests and our objectives and our policy actually point in exactly the opposite direction. So that's part of it on one side. But on the other hand, AUKUS really is a statement of Australia's alignment with US policies to the max. So when Jake Sullivan did his, what you might call, exit interview with the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago, he described AUKUS as a marriage between America and Australia for 50 years. And that's how they see it. And we should pay careful attention to how America sees AUKUS, because it's their view that counts. And we should also pay careful attention to how others see AUKUS, and they'll see it the way the United States does. So I think there is an inherent contradiction in our policy. On the one hand, in very material ways, we're committing ourselves to supporting the United States, or what might I say, supporting the United States policy as it was declared to be under Biden, much less so under Trump, as we've discussed. But we're not actually doing anything to make it real. And so, there really is a contradiction here. The problem for us is that we're also not doing anything material to put ourselves in a better position to defend ourselves independently, if I'm right, and the United States is out.
Thank you, Hugh. Now, again, I recognise we're getting close to 11 o'clock. Is Pete Connolly, where's Pete Connolly? Oh, there you are, good, you're down the back. Pete, I know you're shy. You've recently returned from PNG. You've studied changes in China's statecraft in the Pacific Islands for many years. Can you just give us a bit of a view into context of the threat, benign at one, depending, it's benign or status or otherwise, as varying views in the room, but how do you see it from the Pacific Islands, where your work has been?
Thanks, Malcolm, for your question without notice. I guess I see it the way we view it, and I also see it the way Pacific Islanders view it, and that is two different things. And the reason I've just been in Papua New Guinea is to try to communicate my research findings to as many Pacific Islanders as I can. And I'm finding it fascinating how many of them will turn up to large audiences to listen to that. And a lot of them say to me afterwards, you know, we've never heard anyone discuss this publicly in our country. So they're not pushing back on it. They actually have a thirst for knowledge. But what I'm talking to them about is the way China's statecraft changed significantly in their countries. And I'm particularly focused on the Melanesian independent states from 2017 onwards. And it's the period 2017 to 2022 that I particularly focus on. And that's in a number of stages, but I look at political statecraft, economic statecraft, and security statecraft. And they more or less happened in that sequence, the way that I present it. And I guess the conclusion I'd come to from all of that is that China has put in a demonstrable effort to increase its geopolitical influence in those countries in recent times, really centering around APEC 2018 in PNG and the geopolitical achievements that China made during that event, but also that it's clearly looking for geostrategic access in those countries, and some would say it's had some success in the Solomon Islands in particular, whilst also looking for resource accumulation. But all of these things, I would say, are quite contrary to Australia's interests. And I do find it surprising that we don't seem to be talking about anything like that this morning. And in particular, that we don't see China as a threat, or at least one member of the panellists, I believe, said that. I'm still not sure what the other two members think in answering that question, but I do think we have a difference of interest with China. I think the competition has come to the countries immediately around us, and that probably we need to be thinking harder about how we compete with China. And that then comes back into what's the US relationship to how we do that.
Can I just perhaps just indulge a little bit here? The view that Kurt Campbell, you know, formerly the Deputy Secretary for this part of the world in the Biden administration, and obviously very well known to many of us here, Kurt's always taken the view that the Pacific is something that Australia should be, you know, taking care of or paying more attention to. That's why they were very disappointed with the developments in the Solomon Islands a few years ago. But I mean, an example that we went through when I was PM was the proposal, you may recall, to build for Huawei to build with, you know, Chinese funding, a fibre optic link between the Solomons, PNG, and, you know, the global internet. And we were not thrilled about that. But rather than saying you can't land it in Brisbane, which is an easy thing to say, which is no solution, we went back and said, we'll pay for it. We'll build it, we'll fund it out of the aid budget, and I think we funded about 80% of it. Do you feel that Australia needs to do more proactively in the Pacific along those lines?
Absolutely. I thought that was a good decision at the time, not just because it got the right effect, but because it was going to be better accepted by the Pacific Islands, and they do have some agency in these decisions. And the best way to counter Huawei in that case was to provide ourselves. I just wonder whether there's more of that we should be doing, and that should be getting factored into how we look at the preservation of our own interests in our immediate region. And I just got to add a quick caveat to all of that, that the Pacific Islands perspective on this competition is very different to ours.
What is the perspective there?
Most of the Pacific Islanders that I've got to know in the last 10 years tend to see this as a geopolitical competition between the US and China, and at times Australia, which they don't want to be involved in. They want back to a point just made before, they want the right to hedge. They want the right to be able to observe and make the most out of this competition, noting their own position. And that makes sense when you think about it strategically for them. And I don't think we can really expect them to make a choice because, like was mentioned with Southeast Asia before, that's not in their interest. So we have to be very respectful and understanding of that in order to preserve the influence we have and perhaps generate more influence in that domain.
We have to have solutions, yeah.
Malcolm,
yeah.
seeing I've been verbaled, I just need to come in.
Right.
I never once said China didn't present a threat. It's the scale, it's the nature, the problem is it's just a blanket assertion of a China threat. And we never really talk about how big it is, how does it come to us, what's its form. And the Pacific, for sure. I mean, if there's geopolitical competition in the Pacific, there is geopolitical competition. That's what great powers do. And I made the point very clearly that China, as a great power, will project power globally, and it will do so more and more. And the Pacific will be part of that contest. And the Pacific aren't out of it, they're in it. I mean, they're exercising agency as all small and medium-sized countries do, and that's what they should be doing. And it might help if we do a bit more of that for ourselves. And just a final point, if you want us more in the Pacific, Trump's helped us because he's closed down US aid, if you've noticed. So someone's going to have to fill that gap.
So just, I've neglected Sam, although Sam is speaking on a panel shortly, but yes.
Please, I do not feel neglected. Sam Roggeveen from the Lowy Institute. My question arises from something Heather said about the Australian political class, but it really goes to all of you, in fact all four of you, if you like. As of last Friday, we're now in an election campaign, and it seems to me that absent some kind of intervention from Trump himself, such as may happen with regard to tariffs on the 2nd of April, that both of our major parties will be content over the next 5 weeks to talk not at all about the kind of first order issues relating to the alliance that we're discussing here today. The kind of first order questions that are being asked in Ottawa, that are being asked in Brussels and all around Europe. My question is simply, how do you explain that?
Well, we haven't got much time. Does anyone want to have a go?
Maybe I'll kick off. Sam, I don't think it's new. I think you could say this about, having those honest conversations with the Australian public over the last 15 years or so. Like I said, I don't think our politicians have really squared it up with the population about what is going on in our world. We were talking about how we don't mention the word China as a strategic threat, but not only how our external circumstances have changed, but again, back, I guess, to my comments about what needs to happen in terms of our economy in order to position ourselves. And obviously, cost of living is front and centre and other issues, but I think and Ken Henry's written very clearly about, not talking about the reforms that we need on tax and whatever. We are really setting up the next generation with not a lot of the tools and capabilities to deal with the issues that we are facing.
Any other?
Well, Sam, you've written about the collapse of the two-party construct as a way of doing politics, and I think this is a perfect demonstration. Both sides of politics have regarded the issues as too big and too scary and too complex. They don't have easy answers, because there aren't easy answers. This is really difficult. It's the biggest shift in Australia's international setting since European settlement, arguably. And our political system has failed to throw up leaders that are prepared to really engage in this issue. And it's not this alone, of course. There's a laundry list of other major issues, productivity and housing and so on, climate change arguably, that we're not dealing with effectively.
Malcolm, if I could just say very quickly, I wonder, Sam, if there's not a sleeper here in the election. Because I've been doing a lot of speaking, promoting my book, with groups of, the Lyceum Club in Melbourne, 70% professional women, 30% spouses trailing along. And everyone's asking these questions. Everyone, wherever I speak, I accept, people think the book's a lot of nonsense, but no one pushes back.
very
No one. No one pushes back. And what they're saying is, oh, thank goodness someone's speaking like this. Thank goodness we've got these issues out there. I think both parties could be in for a real shock on
But
this.
as long as neither party raises it,
Yeah.
they get away with it.
Maybe the Teals will raise it.
Yes, the Teals.
But look, can I just we're just about on time. Can I thank everybody? And I just as given we're ending on the failings of politicians, which of course is something there'll be unanimity about. I think I'd say, Sam, just in concluding, that one of the challenges too is the focus is only on politics, is only on what is in contention. You know, politics is reported on as a football match, and if there isn't contest, then no one is interested. So bipartisanship has its virtues sometimes, but not when it's effectively gaslighting us on a big issue. And I'd say also, I mean, just reflect on this. As Ben Westcott from Bloomberg recalls, I gave a pre-mundane interview to Bloomberg the other day about, you know, Trump's impact on markets and so forth. Nothing remotely inflammatory. In fact, nothing that many others hadn't said before. Donald was watching it and took a caption and put out a post on his social media site. Immediately, most of the Australian media attacked me for daring to incur the indignation of Trump. And I have to give credit to the Sydney Morning Herald for writing an editorial saying this is nuts. You know, Turnbull should be allowed to say what he likes. And of course, if we're all going to be intimidated into not talking about these issues, then we will never be able to address them, hence today. Thank you all very much, and we'll have a break back at 11:15.